WMAQ, AM and FM, NBC in Chicago. Stay tuned now for Americana. This is Americana.
I'd like to watch a passenger train hauled by a big, snorting prairie-type engine, headlamp and all car lights on, flitting across the great level open spaces of Nebraska. I'd like to take my stand deep in the northern spruce forest, to hear the hoarse cry of a freight climbing through a mountain valley. No sight, no sound in my native land so stir my imagination as those do. I think of them as unmistakably American as the Stars and Stripes and the Constitution.
The words you have just heard were written by Stuart Holbrook in the story of American railroads. This program is Americana, the third in a series of radio essays on the American scene, presented each week by Northwestern University in cooperation with station WMAQ. Tonight, we bring you Memoirs of a Railroad Century.
Good evening. I'm Martin Maloney of the School of Speech at Northwestern University. I added a new record to my modest collection the other day, and I'm greatly pleased with it. A very exciting series of sounds indeed are preserved in its microgrooves. Now, I don't know, of course, whether you're a record collector or not. If you aren't, let me tell you that within the past few years, commercial recordings have come out in such great plenty and of such superb quality that a library of records nowadays can be almost as fascinating as a library of books. And that, believe me, is a very considerable admission for me to make. Anyway, if you listen much to new music, you know that the conventional thing for a young and obscure musician to do, if he wants to become an old and famous musician, is to produce something which can be called a new sound in music. There have been so many new sounds in music lately that it's become a little difficult to remember what music ought to sound like. Now, my new record provides you with a set of sounds that you've heard all your life, though perhaps not quite in this way, that is, not quite as musical sounds. That they are musical, a sort of percussion with calliope effect, I'll try to demonstrate shortly. For the sounds are the sounds of trains. The record is called Rail Dynamics, and it's one of the most interesting and ingenious recordings in the Sounds of Our Times series. The trains, I judge from the record case, are supplied by courtesy of the New York Central.
And now where are you? In a train. Any train, going someplace not quite decided on. And it's night. It's always been night, 100 or 1,000 times before. You're lying in a berth or sitting up in a chair car, and you feel the train move and rock beneath you, and you hear the crossing bells sharp through the rumble and click of the rails. You move on through the darkness, and your destination is not quite clear to you or very important. But the sense of great speed and the sounds and the mystery of hurtling on through the darkness, these are important. The year and the mission make no difference. You are the new president, Abraham Lincoln, traveling secretly into Washington for fear of assassination, with the train darkened and Pinkerton men at either elbow. Or you're a college sophomore making the trip from your hometown, which is Davenport, Iowa, on down to the State University in September. Or you're a hardware salesman leaving Chicago to sell nuts and bolts to the merchants in Ohio. It makes no difference. The sounds are the same. so is the night. Then your train pulls into a siding and stops. And in a moment, in the distance, you'll hear the long, lonely whistle of the train that you're to meet and pass in the darkness.
And this, I insist, is music. A kind of music so close to all of us that it's hard to tell sometimes where the engines leave off and the musicians begin. That the folk musicians of America have begun with train songs is eloquently argued in a selection from the Lomax folk song, USA, which Benjamin Botkin has included in his Treasury of Railroad Folklore.
All through that strip of country that runs from Maryland south and west to Oklahoma, which is the land of fiddlers, guitar players, banjo pickers, and harp blowers, you can hear them making lonesome whistle tunes on their instruments. A fiddler will pull his bow in a long minor moan across his top string and then start jerking it in quick, raspy strokes until you can close your eyes and hear a heavy freight train running down a steep grade. A harmonica player will blow out the high, hollering notes of a fast passenger engine, while the guitar player will make a rhythm on his bass strings like a train crossing a trestle. Together they'll play in the rhythm of car wheels clicking under sleepers. As counter-rhythm, they'll whip out the rattling bounce of a caboose as it shakes and jounces along a rough roadbed. And then they'll throw back their heads and holler, "Oh, Lord, Lord, I hate to hear that lonesome whistle blow." Yes, these folk musicians and the people that they're playing for, they listen to railroad whistles the way fisher folk listen to bell buoys and foghorns. Out in the country, they tell time by the whistles of the trains that fly past their fields. The railroad whistles bring them good news and bad news. The whistles talk to them about the places they've never been, the women they've never seen, the fine clothes they've never worn. And the whistles talk to them about the folks who have gone down that long, lonesome road and won't be back again. The whistles talk to them about the great, big, raw country they live in. The whistles remind them that every man is a traveler on a lonesome road.
Well, there's one trouble with writing as colorfully and as enthusiastically as the Lomaxes do. You're likely to be put down as an enthusiast and not believed. But luckily for everyone concerned, I think we can demonstrate where at least some of our folk songs come from. This is that wandering troubadour Cisco Houston, singing one of the best, though not the most familiar of railroad songs, 900 Miles. And if you don't hear the rails clicking and the engines hooting in this one, I despair of you.
I am walking down this track. I've got tears in my eyes. I'm trying to read a letter from my home. And if this train runs me right, I'll be home Saturday night. 'Cause I'm 900 miles from my home. And I hate to hear that lonesome whistle blow. That long, lonesome train whistling down. Well, the train I ride on is 100 coaches long.
You know, every year so far on these Americana broadcasts, I've yielded to temptation at least once and written a script on railroading. In this third series, I began to feel that I should have some sort of excuse for talking railroading again. A very slender excuse would serve, but I had to have something. A friend of mine told me that October 1954 was the centennial anniversary of something pretty important in American railroading, but he didn't say what. That was enough to give me my title, Memoirs of a Railroad Century. And then after a while, I started out to discover what notable railroading event had taken place in October 1854. In all honesty, I must report to you that as far as I can learn, not a thing happened of any consequence in that month and year. And still, the idea of talking about a century of American railroading rather appeals to me. For the fact is that for over 20 years, we have celebrated a long sequence of railroad centennials.
1830, the first American locomotive. And in 1830, the first American passenger railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, opened 14 miles of track to horse-drawn rail car traffic. 1831, the first train in the United States drawn by steam, from Albany to Schenectady.
And so on through a long list of first achievements of great American railroads put in operation a century ago. And we shall not really be done with these celebrations until May 10th, 1969, the centennial of the completion of the first transcontinental railroad and the Golden Spike. And if the celebration of the 100th anniversary of this event proves to be as raucous an affair as the driving of the Spike was, you'll be able to hear it all the way from Promontory, Utah to Chicago.
I saw the Golden Spike driven at Promontory, Utah on May 10th, 1869. On the last day, only about 100 feet were laid, and everybody tried to have a hand in the work. I took a shovel from an Irishman and threw a shovelful of dirt in the ties just to tell about it afterward. California furnished the Golden Spike. Governor Tuttle of Nevada furnished one of silver. Governor Stafford presented one of gold, silver, and iron from Arizona. The last tie was of California laurel. When they came to drive the last spike, Mr. Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, took the sledge, and the first time he struck, he missed the iron and hit the rail. What a howl went up. Irish, Chinese, Mexicans, and everybody yelled with delight. He missed it! He missed it! The engineers blew their whistles, rang their bells, and then Stanford tried it again and tapped the spike, and the telegraph operators had fixed their instruments so that the tap was reported in all the offices east and west, and set bells to tapping in hundreds of towns and cities. It was a great occasion. Everybody carried off souvenirs, and there are enough splinters of that last tie in museums to make a good bonfire. Both before and after the spike driving ceremonies, there were speeches which were cheered heartily. Oh, I don't remember what any of the speakers said now, but I do remember that there was a great abundance of champagne.
Those were the words of Alexander Tuffence, an old-timer who was there on the day that the rails first spanned the nation. In the California state capitol at Sacramento, incidentally, hangs a picture of the spike driving ceremony which Leland Stanford, then president of the Central Pacific, commissioned a certain Thomas Hill to paint. In their book, Hear the Train Blow, Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg tell the story of the painting. The photograph that was taken of the ceremony bothered Mr. Stanford a little, for it depicted the great event quite accurately as a somewhat rowdy occasion. Hence the painting, which was to clean up the whole affair for posterity. It even shows a half-dozen distinguished people who'd not been at the ceremony at all clustered around Mr. Stanford. But it did no good. The true story leaked out after all. The reason this story interests me is not that the celebration of our first transcontinental railroad was a little noisy, or that Mr. Stanford wished it had been more respectable. I'm rather interested in the fact that people did celebrate the establishment of a successful business, the sort of thing one might imagine to be a cause for private rejoicing among stockholders only. But railroads have always been regarded that way in America, and as far as I know, they are still. It's very much as if the railroads and their history were everyone's property and everyone's achievement. I can't think of any other kind of private enterprise which enjoys this sort of public esteem. I could perhaps make some guesses on the reasons for this phenomenon, but I wanted to do a little better than that. I wanted to consult a veteran railroad man or two and get their opinions. So I spent some time in the office of Downing B. Jenks, Executive Vice President of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, talking railroading with him and William S. Kerr, who was formerly with the Burlington Road and is now a Vice President of Northwestern University. Gentlemen, in reading railroad history, I get a very strong impression that the railroads have been almost unique among American business enterprises in one respect, in that they've had a peculiarly high level of esteem from the public in general.
The interest in the railroads as a whole was best explained to me recently by a friend who bemoaned the passing of the steam engine. He said he used to enjoy hearing at nightfall the moan or the wail of the steam engine as it went across the countryside, carrying the passengers to their homes. And to him, the steam engine epitomized a lasting interest in the railroad. Well, of course, now that's been replaced by the diesel locomotive.
Well, even as far as the diesel locomotive is concerned, whistles have been developed for the diesel that are designed to sound like the steam engine.
Oh, that's a good...
I think just for the reason that you mentioned, Dr. Maloney.
I come from a railroad family myself, and this is the thing that always struck me. I don't know any group of men who seem to enjoy their work quite as much as railroaders. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, a railroad runs 24 hours a day. And for an operating man particularly, you have to be available 24 hours a day because things happen at night and on Sundays and holidays just the same as they do any other time. And you have to be there to take care of any emergencies or unusual things that come up, in addition to the routine everyday work. Now, anybody that...
Excuse me for interrupting, sir, but you must have had something of an emergency here a few days ago when we were flooded out. What sort of a job did you have then?
Fortunately, it didn't affect the Rock Island very much.
Well, I just want to point out one thing, that the old iron horse, which, as we admit today, for economical reasons, is fast disappearing, yet during the recent heavy rains, we had to resort, or at least I understand several railroads had to resort to the steam engine to pull trains through water, which was at that time too deep for the operation of the diesel.
I remember down on the CNEI in 1949, we had 7 miles of the main line covered by the Wabash River. We pulled trains through a depth of 30 inches of water at that time.
With diesel?
No, with steam power. Ordinarily, you don't operate the diesels in more than 6 inches of water.
I think one thing has not been mentioned about the continuing interest in railroads, and that is that every home in USA, or practically every home, has a model railroad. Bought presumably for the son, but I think quite often the father himself spends a lot of time operating that model railroad.
You're not a model fan, are you, Mr. Kerr?
Yes, I have a railroad.
Have you?
And I think Mr. Jenks has too, if you ask him.
Well, when I bought my boy an electric train, my wife said, I don't think Donnie's old enough yet for his father to have an electric train.
Good.
Going back to a question you asked earlier, we have see quite a few fellows just out of school that we interview for jobs on the railroad. And when we ask a good number of them why they want to go into the railroad business, quite frequently we hear, well, I always liked electric trains, and there's something fascinating about it, and that's why I want to get into railroad work.
Do you hire them on that basis?
No. We try to point out to them the things about it that are rather tough and disagreeable, so they know what they're getting into. But there's one thing about it, when the troubles do happen, when you get called out at night, or on a Sunday or some other time like that, it's generally very interesting. It might be a derailment, or it might be a washout, or it might be some other thing that occurs. And you can always be sure there's never a dull moment.
Before I left Mr. Jenks's office, I borrowed from him a short manuscript which he had written, together with a sound record of Rock Island trains. I wanted you to hear both the trains and the words, which happened to be about the personalities of engines.
Locomotives had personalities in the old days. In early railroading, each engine crew on regular turns had its own engine. Engineer and fireman jealously pampered the old girl, groomed her, and lavished tender care upon her. I remember engineers who even had linoleum on the cab floor and who, if they had to take time off, lived and died 1,000 deaths worrying about what some other runner might do to their precious engines. One of the most thrilling sights one could ever witness in the days when steam ruled the rails was the big mallets on a mountain grade. The road engine in front and helper engines cut into the train, battling a 3% rise with 50 or 60 freight loads headed for the Continental Divide, the top of the world. Many pictures of such scenes have been taken, and they're highly prized by the rail enthusiasts, many of whom have never seen a mountain or heard the bark of a mallet's exhaust in that desperate pull against gravity. Well, today we've said farewell to steam. The very young children of today will, as they reach adolescence, never know the sight of blurring rods and the high drivers of a speeding northern-type steamer. They'll never hear the music of the exhaust staccato from the sawed-off stack. But they'll still find a thrill at the road of a sleek diesel wheeling a silver streak past the pasture fence, and they'll still watch the tailgate of the Limited vanish from sight with a stepped-up pulse and a dream of far-off places.
To look back on the history of railroading in this country is to be amazed sometimes at the enthusiasm with which the new railroads were greeted as they were built. An enthusiasm which expressed itself in large sums of money and in even more surprising ways. Take the case of the Mississippi and Missouri Road, which in the mid-1850s was beginning to spread out in Iowa. The city fathers of Iowa City offered a bonus of $50,000 to the road if a line were to be completed and a train run into town by December 31st, 1855. Well, building railroads is sometimes easier talked about than done. As the story is told in H.W. Bowman's Pioneer Railroads, the M&M had a line running from Davenport to Muscatine by the end of November. But that was all.
But the line was still not into Iowa City. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on December 31st, 1855, the rails were 1,000 feet short of the city boundary. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero. But the road builders drove their men on with the job. Huge fires were built for light and warmth. The enthusiasms of Iowa City's citizens was so great that they, too, pitched in to help. Ties were laid on the frozen ground. Rails were spiked into place in the sketchiest possible fashion. At 30 minutes before midnight, the last rail was laid. The signal was given for the locomotive to move ahead on the final 1,000-foot stretch. In their frenzy to get the rails all down, every available man had been pressed into service, including the engineer and fireman. And during the excitement, the locomotive had been forgotten. The poor, chilled iron beast refused to respond. After 5 minutes of vain coaxing, it wouldn't budge. It was then that chains were hooked to the pilot, and with pinch bars prying at the wheels and the townsfolk pushing, the engine was dragged into the city limits just as the courthouse bells rang out the new year. The bonus was won.
It may strike you that this is a good example of how to get rid of $50,000 the hard way. And yet it made a good deal of sense for the citizens of Iowa City to turn out and help the Mississippi and Missouri earn that big bonus. For in those days, when the railroads came, towns prospered. And when the railroads did not come, they withered. And in America in general, it was all much the same. The first railroads found America a colony. The latest ones have left her a nation. Railroads have become the property of everyone and have been translated into the folklore of everyone. Leaf through the pages of a book like Benjamin Botkin's fine Treasury of Railroad Folklore and see what a medley of people and events you'll find. The entrepreneurs of yesterday, the Goulds and the Stanfords, rub elbows with the great corporations of today, and both step aside for the obscure and immortal heroes of the profession, Casey Jones, for example, and John Henry.
When John Henry was a little baby, he was sitting on his mammy's knees. Well, he stuck out his hand and he grabbed a piece of steel. Says, gonna be the death of me. Well, it's gonna be the death of me. John Henry told his captain, well, a man ain't nothing but a man. And before I let this steam drill beat me down, I'll die with this hammer in my hand. Well, I'll die with this hammer in my hand. Henry said to his shaker, well, now, shaker, why don't you sing? 'Cause I'm throwing 9 pounds from my hips on down. Just listen to the cold steel ring. Boy, just listen to the cold steel ring. John Henry said to his shaker, well, now, shaker, why don't you pray? 'Cause if my hammer missed that little piece of steel, tomorrow be your barren day. Well, tomorrow be your barren day.
At the risk of overdoing my enthusiasm for Mr. Botkin and his railroad treasury, I should like to quote one more passage from this book. You may think these lines a little sentimental, and I have no doubt that they are. But for me, they explain much of the charm, the special charm that railroading has for me. This passage is mostly about the local train, or what railroaders used to call, in my younger days, the plug.
With the passing of steam, an era for many, the great era of railroading, came to an end and passed into folklore. Those were the days, the roaring days, the reckless, restless, harum-scarum days, when rules, including Rule G, were too often honored in the breach rather than in the observance. While speed, comfort, and safety, the triple goal of railroad competition and public relations, too often got in each other's way. Those were the days, too, of simple pleasures. The age of innocence, symbolized by the leisurely casualness and neighborliness of poky little locals on branch and short lines, and old-fashioned depots in inland communities, ranging from a one-horse flag station in the middle of the prairie to a bustling railroad town. If there were giants in those days, there were also little fellows, and the latter have a special place in the memories of old times. Because, among other reasons, he who travels by rail over the lesser lines of the USA clangs and shunts straight into his own childhood. You have been listening to Americana, the third in the series of radio essays dealing with American history and American living, presented each week by Northwestern University in cooperation with station WMAQ. Americana is written and narrated by Martin Maloney. Direction is by Ralph Knowles. Music supervision by Maury Streetmatter. Engineering by Harold Whitteberry. Sound by Kurt Mitchell. And turntable operation by Bob Petrillo. The quoted materials were read by myself, Bill Grisky. Books mentioned on this program include Benjamin Botkin's A Treasury of Railroad Folklore, published by Crown, H.W. Bowman's Pioneer Railroads, a Facet book, and Hear the Train Blow by Lucius Beebe and Charles Craig, published by E.P. Dutton and Company. And if you would like to receive a list of the books discussed on this program, please send your name and address on a postcard to Americana, the School of Speech, Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, and a free copy will be sent to you. This is NBC Radio.